On the morning of February 23, 1995, an executive at Barings Bank in London opened his email to find a message that didn't make any sense. It wasn't a business proposal or a market update. It was a short, cryptic note from their star trader in Singapore, a 28-year-old named Nick Leeson. The note simply said, "I'm sorry," and mentioned he was feeling unwell. By the time that email was read, Nick was already gone, leaving behind a half-eaten sandwich on his desk and a financial crater so large it would swallow a 200-year-old institution whole. Barings wasn't just any bank. This was the bank that helped finance the Napoleonic Wars. It was the bank where the British royal family kept their private accounts. It was a symbol of British stability, an unbreakable fortress of old money. And yet, in the span of a few years, a working-class kid from Watford had managed to lose $1.4 billion. To put that in perspective, that's like losing $1 million every single day for nearly 4 years straight. If you stacked that much cash in $100 bills, it would stand taller than the World Trade Center. The story everyone tells is about greed, but that's too simple. The real story is about a psychological trap called the gambler's fallacy, and a massive hole in the system that Nick Leeson walked right through. See, in the early 90s, Nick was sent to Singapore to head up the futures trading desk. He was a rock star. He was making so much money for the firm that nobody bothered to check his homework. But there was a fatal flaw in the setup. In a normal bank, the person who places the bets, the trader, is completely separate from the person who keeps the books. It's a system of checks and balances. But in Singapore, Nick was in charge of both. He was the player and the referee. He was the guy driving the getaway car and the lead investigator on the case. The nightmare didn't start with a billion-dollar heist. It started with a mistake. A junior employee under Nick's supervision made a small error, losing about £20,000. Instead of reporting it and taking a hit to his reputation, Nick decided to hide it. He opened a secret account, number 88888, 8 being a lucky number in Chinese culture. He figured he'd just trade a little extra the next day, make the 20 grand back, and close the account. No one would ever know. But he didn't win. He lost. So he doubled down to cover the new loss. Then he quadrupled down. It was a classic loss aversion spiral. To the bosses in London, Nick looked like a genius because he was reporting record profits. In reality, he was bleeding out in secret, using the bank's own money to gamble on the Japanese stock market, hoping for one big win to wipe the slate clean. He was living a double life, acting the part of the high-flying executive by day, while staring at a growing black hole of debt every night. By early 1995, the secret debt in account 88888 had grown to hundreds of millions. Nick was desperate. He placed a massive bet that the Japanese market wouldn't move much overnight. It was a short straddle, a technical way of saying he was betting on stability. He just needed the world to stay quiet for a few days so he could escape. Then, at 5:46 a.m. on January 17th, the earth literally shook. A massive earthquake hit Kobe, Japan. The markets didn't stay quiet. They screamed. The Japanese stock index plummeted, and Nick's carefully constructed house of cards began to shake with it. As the losses shifted from millions into the billions, Nick realized he couldn't hide the evidence anymore. The silent witness wasn't a physical object, but a series of digital numbers that were about to scream the truth to the entire world. He had one final, frantic plan to save himself, but time was a luxury he no longer had. The markets didn't stay quiet. They screamed. The Japanese stock index plummeted, and Nick's carefully constructed house of cards began to shake with it. As the losses shifted from millions into the billions, Nick realized he couldn't hide the evidence anymore. The silent witness wasn't a physical object, but a series of digital numbers that were about to scream the truth to the entire world. He had one final, frantic plan to save himself, but time was a luxury he no longer had. To understand how a 28-year-old from Watford managed to bring a 2-century-old institution to its knees, you have to look at the loophole he exploited. It wasn't some complex piece of code or a high-level conspiracy. It was a simple, old-fashioned failure of oversight. In the world of high finance, you're supposed to have a front office that makes the trades and a back office that checks the books. They're meant to be separate, like a church and state, to keep everyone honest. But in Singapore, Nick Leeson was the king of both. He was the star player and the referee at the same time. He was essentially grading his own homework, and he was giving himself straight A's while failing every subject. The heart of this deception was account 8, 8888. In Chinese culture, 8 is the number of prosperity and luck, but for Barings Bank, it became a black hole that swallowed everything. It started as a way to hide a small mistake made by a junior staffer, about $30,000, a rounding error for a bank like Barings. But Nick didn't want to admit even a small failure. He tucked it away in the error account, thinking he'd trade his way back to even and close it out. But the gambler's fallacy is a hell of a drug. When you're down, you don't walk away. You double down because you're due for a win. Nick started using account 88888 to hide his own mounting losses. By the end of 1992, the hole was $2 million. By 1994, it was $30 million. By the time the Kobe earthquake hit in early 1995, that number had ballooned into a billion-dollar nightmare. To give you a sense of the scale, that's like losing the entire value of a fleet of 20 Boeing 747s, all while telling your boss you're actually making enough profit to buy a private island. The psychology here is fascinating and terrifying. Nick wasn't a mustache-twirling villain. He was a man paralyzed by the fear of looking like a failure. He had become the golden boy of the bank, the guy who generated 10% of their total global profit. He couldn't go back to being ordinary. He couldn't admit he'd messed up. So, he lived a double life. During the day, he was the loud, confident, turbo arbitrageur, throwing around millions with a smirk. At night, he was a ghost, staying late to forge documents and move digital money around like a shell game, trying to stay one step ahead of the auditors. The earthquake in Kobe was the black swan event he never saw coming. He had bet the entire house on the Japanese market staying stable. When the earth cracked, so did his reality. He spent the following weeks in a blind panic, buying more and more contracts, trying to single-handedly prop up the entire Japanese stock market. It was like trying to stop a tsunami with a beach bucket. By February 23, 1995, the internal auditors were finally asking questions that couldn't be answered with a shrug or a forged spreadsheet. They noticed a missing chunk of $80 million, a tiny fraction of the total loss, but it was the loose thread that would pull the whole sweater apart. Nick knew he was done. He didn't wait for the handcuffs. He walked out of the office, left a note on his desk that simply read, "I'm sorry," and vanished. He and his wife caught a flight to Malaysia, then to Thailand, starting a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek with international authorities. But as he sat in a luxury hotel half a world away, watching the news of the bank's collapse break on every channel, he realized the "I'm sorry" note wasn't going to be enough to stop what was coming for him. Because while Nick was running, the true extent of what he'd done was finally being tallied. And the world was about to find out that Barings Bank wasn't just hurting, it was already dead. When the news finally hit the wires, it didn't just rattle the financial world, it broke it. Imagine a bank that survived the Napoleonic Wars, a bank that literally helped finance the Louisiana Purchase for the United States, being wiped out by a single employee who hadn't even turned 30 yet. The final tally was staggering, £827 million. In today's money, That's well over $2 billion. To put that in perspective, Nick Leeson didn't just lose a fortune, he lost more money than the entire capital of the bank itself. The ultimate price tag for the bank's 233-year history was a single British pound. That's what the Dutch firm ING paid to buy the remains of Barings. £1, the price of a pack of gum for a global empire. While the world was staring at those impossible numbers, Nick and his wife, Lisa, were living out of suitcases, moving from one luxury hotel to another across Southeast Asia. But you can't outrun a billion-dollar hole forever. The invisible threat wasn't the police at his door just yet. It was the psychological weight of what he'd done. Nick wasn't some master thief who had a getaway plan and a secret offshore account filled with stolen millions. That's the most bizarre part of this whole tragedy. He didn't have the money. He hadn't siphoned it off to a private island. He had simply lost it. He had bet on the house, and the house had collapsed on top of him. On March 2nd, 1995, the run ended. Nick was detained at the airport in Frankfurt, Germany. He looked less like a high-flying financial wizard and more like a man who hadn't slept in a month. He was eventually extradited back to Singapore, where the reality of his situation finally set in. He was sentenced to 6.5 years in a high-security prison. It was there, in a cramped cell, far from the roaring trade floors, that the Paper King had to reckon with his own mind. Psychologically, Nick was the victim of a classic gambler's fallacy. He honestly believed that if he just doubled down one more time, the market would have to turn in his favor. He had become obsessed with the 88888 account, treating it like a living thing he had to feed with more and more risk. This wasn't just greed, it was a pathological fear of being seen as a failure. In his head, admitting to a small mistake was worse than risking the entire bank to cover it up. The most chilling part of the Nick Leeson story isn't the money, though. It's the silent witness left behind in the ruins, the internal audit reports that no one bothered to read. For years, Nick was allowed to be his own boss and his own referee. He was the one making the trades, and he was the one checking the books to make sure those trades were legal. It was a massive systemic failure that proved even the most prestigious institutions are only as strong as their weakest oversight. Today, Nick Leeson is a free man, a keynote speaker who warns others about the very path he took. But the ghost of the 88888 account still haunts the corridors of global finance. Even with all our modern technology and sophisticated algorithms, rogue traders continue to pop up every few years, proving that the human element, the ego, the fear, and the desperation is something no computer program can fully control. We like to think we've built a foolproof system, but history shows us that all it takes is one person with enough pressure and a secret drawer to hide the truth in. The fall of Barings Bank wasn't just a financial collapse. It was a masterclass in how easily the world's most powerful structures can be dismantled from the inside by a man who simply couldn't afford to say, "I failed."